Hello everyone, my name is Fabia Fernandes Carvalho. I am Deputy Coordinator of the Masters and PhD programs here at São Paulo Law School at Getúlio Vargas Foundation. I'm here with Professor Leslie-Anne Duvic-Paoli from King's College London. Professor Leslie-Anne is a senior lecturer in environmental law at the Dickson Poon School of Law. Leslie-Anne is a public international lawyer with research interests in environmental, climate, and energy law. Her scholarship covers the ambiguous role played by environmental principles, the global legal implications of the clean energy transition, and the role of citizens' assemblies in the making of climate law and policy. Professor Leslie-Anne is here at FGV to teach a short-term course as part of the São Paulo Law School Global Law Program. Her course is on Planetary and Human Sustainability, international law, and climate change. So Leslie-Anne, it's great to have you here with us. I wanted to start by inviting you to tell us a little bit of your experience here at the São Paulo Law School, teaching environmental law, international environmental law in a global south country with students from the global south. So it would be great to hear from your experience.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be spending this week with you and also with the students. So I've really enjoyed my time here. So the course is entitled Planetary and Human Sustainability, looking at the question of sustainable development from the perspective of international law and climate change. And it's, let's say, a course that I usually give at King's to my students, but revisited for, I hope, a Brazilian audience. And my focus has been to think a little bit more about how climate law can interact with this idea of sustainable development. So what does it mean when we need climate mitigation and climate adaptation in a country like Brazil, and what is international law able to tell us about the obligations and the rights of states in this context?
Wow, this is super interesting, and I would love to hear more from you. If you could tell us in more detail what kind of specific lens you have been adding to your own teaching while it's a course that you teach at King's and now in Brazil. What kind of specificities or particularities that you think have been productive in your teaching here concerning the Brazilian context?
Yes, so I think the course is not only a course in international climate law, but it's really about how international law deals with climate change. And so it's much broader than just looking at what the Paris Agreement says, sure, for instance. And so in the context of this course, I've been debating with the students questions around historical responsibilities, for instance, what is the place and responsibility of emerging economies in terms of reducing emissions compared to historical emitters, and also focusing on some important sectors for Brazil, in particular agriculture and energy, that are very important for the country and that are producing, of course, emissions, but that are also solutions for a more sustainable type of economy. So we've been talking about how international law deals with questions around agriculture, food security, renewable energies that are so important here in Brazil, and all this in the context of sustainable development. What does it mean in terms of access to energy, affordability of energy, etc. And in the last few sessions, we're going to be also talking about what climate change means for our public institutions. So we're going to be, of course, talking about climate litigation, which is very important, not only in the north, but also in countries like Brazil. So I'm keen also to learn from students about their own perspective on climate litigation here in Brazil. And then we'll also be talking about broader questions around public participation and democracy. And this is also something that has brought me to Brazil as someone who's working on these questions. I think that Brazil is one of the biggest democracies in the world, very innovative in terms of democratic innovations and new mechanisms to involve the public. And so I'm quite interested also in thinking about what does climate change mean for a democracy like Brazil.
Okay, wonderful. This is very interesting, as I have been taking a look at your research and publications, and I found particularly productive for this conversation about how to teach a discipline that has a universal ambition, to use your contribution, in different places across the planet, but on the one hand with common challenges and perspectives for some sort of transformation. So it would be great to hear from you. How do you think, to start with, and going for the ambitious piece now that you have published last year, do you think we can deal with international environmental law and climate change with the same ambition in every place in the world? How do you see this? Are there differences, not just contextual ones, but in terms of the normative framework that we're trying to develop or to somehow put forward in order to have some sort of transformation, this ambition of international environmental law?
Yes, thank you. It's a difficult question. I've been, as you've said, I've been working on this idea of ambition in international environmental law and more broadly in international law, coming from what the Paris Agreement tells us, that states need to put forward climate plans that represent their highest level of ambition. And so what does that mean, right? It looks very positive, but how do optimistic, right? And we have this idea of constant progress, right? We're always going to do better. Every 5 years, we're going to do better, etc. But at the same time, this idea of ambition is also something that might not be reachable, right? It's maybe at some point we'll realize that it's something that we cannot fulfill. And so I'm quite interested in this idea that states are going to have to show that they are ambitious with their actions. But of course, as you've said, this really depends on the countries, and the ambition of a historical emitter is going to be very different from the ambition of an emerging economy or a vulnerable country. And of course, that's something that is the complexity of international climate law, of international environmental law, is that the interests of states are just so different, and at the same time, we all need to move in the same direction. So how do we take into account all these different interests? How do we keep everybody on board? And how do we actually advance together on this path at a speed that is fast enough, because now things are starting to become urgent?
Yeah, no, for sure. So would you say that in this setting, the experience here teaching in Brazil for students that are somehow experiencing specific issues with climate litigation, and your particular students here at Getúlio Vargas Foundation, would you say that this experience would enrich the lens of ambition in the way that you work in this piece published at the Leiden Journal? Would you say that we could somehow, I wouldn't say negotiate, but I mean, it's very optimistic and in a way a horizon for us to think about how to transform our reality through law. But on the other hand, we know that these are historical differences between the North and the South, and therefore I'm not sure if different ambitions can actually pave the way for exceptions and then the whole failure of international climate change law or international environmental law with this super high level of hope or optimism. So I wanted to
yes.
go deeper into that.
So, as I've said, I think, of course, there's this discourse around ambition in climate law, but there's also a discourse of ambition in other fields of environmental law, in biodiversity, plastics, and we've seen it also in sustainable development goals, right? So it's not constrained to climate law,
yes,
and so there's also in the field of sustainable development this idea also of ambition, right? Yeah. So it's not only the ambition of protecting the planet, but actually it's also the ambition of eradicating poverty, of continuing economic growth in a way that still fits our planetary boundaries, etc. So I think ambition is actually everywhere in international law, and that's what makes it interesting, because we don't actually focus so much on it, because we hear about it, but then we're not exactly sure what it means. I think talking to the students here, of course, the first few days when you actually show them the facts of science,
sure,
it can, I think for them, it can be quite difficult, right? Because we have less than 10 years to make drastic changes. And that's true of the global north, that of course they have a burden of climate harm, but it's also true of other economies as well that do still contribute to emissions. And so I think the first few days of the course, it's probably more this idea of crisis, right?
Okay.
That we hear about international law, because international law so far has not been able to give us an answer to the climate problem. So what we see in the first few days of the class is that it's been over 30 years that we've been having international cooperation on climate change, and yet here we are, here's the graph, emissions need to go down like this. And so I think students might be a bit pessimistic at the beginning of the class, because it seems like something that is impossible, a public policy problem that is impossible to solve at the domestic and international level. And that's why perhaps I wrote an article about ambition, but I'm an optimist, right?
Of course.
And that's probably why I'm an international lawyer as well. So as much as I can see that, of course, international law is facing different types of crises and is not able to give all the answers that we would like, I think just looking, for instance, at the Paris Agreement, it's a wonderful piece of international law. I think you can see the different interests of states represented to a certain extent in that treaty. And already this is extraordinary, right? And the fact that it's not only a treaty for states, but it's something that has had an influence very, very broadly. Corporations, universities, civil society, all of them are using this instrument for their discourse. And so I think this is something that gives us some normative directions about where to go. It's not perfect, of course, but it's really setting the scene. And I think it's giving us some hope and at least some motivation, because when you have ambition, you have motivation. Right? You want to achieve something. You're not looking at something that is completely unreachable. You're at least striving towards doing something better. And I think this is what we see with the Paris Agreement.
Okay. Great. I'm not sure if I share the optimism feeling.
I completely understand that it's difficult.
Yes.
But I think something that we've seen is that if we tell people that it's going to be too difficult, then people disengage. And so that's really not what we want. We want actually new ideas, new people, new action.
Sure, and I agree with you. I think we have to technically properly understand the vocabulary of international environmental law. At least in the way I see it, it has other allies outside law that can definitely be part of this movement into some transformative objectives and to actually change some sort of, or even reform on an incremental basis our reality. But I definitely agree with you that we need to engage seriously with international law. I'm not a skeptical person, but I'm always thinking about how to actually address this universality of the field, which is also the case of international environmental law, specifically in this context in which we do have the asymmetries between the global south and the global north are salient and are really calling our attention for disagreements that seem to be unresolvable or impossible to solve in a way. So it seems to me that it's always a matter of, I like this idea of having a horizon of, and having law as something that also is part of this political imagination of a different world. But with international environmental law, it seems that the asymmetries between the North and the South are huge, and also not just the North and the South in a kind of stark opposition, but of course we have our countries like Brazil, China, and India that actually are being, we are being called polluters or with high levels of emissions as well, and therefore why we should have this stark difference between historical emitters and countries like Brazil, China, and India, for instance. So in a way, it seems that international environmental law aims to somehow deal with these differences, but at the end of the day, I don't know, political or economic interests might play a big role. So you are an optimistic. And then how do you see your research in, I'm sure it's interdisciplinary, in dialogue with other areas of knowledge. So how would you put yourself in these challenges, considering that these differences won't change and law has limits in order to change the history, what we have been, and the consequences of this history in the present. So if you could maybe go a bit more into the details of your optimism, and then...
Yes, I mean, so I think, as you've highlighted, I think international environmental law is facing quite numerous challenges, not only because we are facing what is called the triple planetary crisis, right, with climate, biodiversity, and pollution. Yeah. And that international environmental law so far has had some successes, like around the ozone layer, for instance. So it's been partially successful, but of course not at the scale that we would like to. And I think to that there are different solutions. And there are people who say, well, we need to completely rethink the field, right? Because the field itself is creating these injustices, these problems, right? And it's perpetuating the problems that we have, right? And then there's the other group that will say, no, we just need to recognize maybe something new and some kind of incremental changes, so a new treaty on plastics or etc., right? And so I guess I am a bit in between.
Okay.
I think it's difficult to change the field drastically given the short amount of time that we have. So I think as academics, it's very important to think about all these problems that international law is creating and perpetuating, and to be aware of them. And also that's why in my work, well, that's why, for instance, I wanted to come to Brazil, for instance, or I'd like to engage with other countries also to understand their perspective, right? Because I think unless you have these conversations and this dialogue, it's very difficult to understand the perspective of others, right? Of course, you can read it in books, but that's all very theoretical. So I think that's the kind of first step, understanding, of course, the perspectives of others, and criticizing what is not actually achieving the overall aim of international environmental law. And then, practically speaking, I think we probably need to think about these kind of incremental changes that might be possible on a shorter scale. And things like the advisory opinions at the International Court of Justice, ITLOS, etc., are, I think, going in that direction of trying to use the law that we have, that is not perfect, but trying to use this as a basis in order to be able to seek accountability or to push for further ambitions.
This is wonderful, and I think we can wait for the end of your course, and I'm sure this will spark new ideas, not just here in Brazil with your students, but also in your research. And I think this dialogue is absolutely necessary, especially international environmental law. So Leslie-Anne, I wish you a wonderful end of your course, and that we can keep the conversation going.
Thank you so
very
much. Thank you.